Cool. So I want to be the first on congratulating you to making it to the A in the acronym NEEP or mean. But we're doing it. Angular. Yes. Applause. Yay! Yay! We've completed an acronym, right? So we've got Node, we've got Express, we've got Postgres, and now Angular, the missing piece.
I didn't even know what that was.
Oh, NEEP? You guys haven't heard NEEP?
No. I mean, I heard James talk about this, tell us don't put it on our resume. Actually,
Yeah, it's kind of like a made-up acronym. You have heard of MEAN, though, so Mongo, Express, Angular, and Node. Yeah.
Are you recording?
I am recording. Can you please read the first objective for me? You, sir.
Define and describe from DC MVVM.
MVVM. Jules, the next one.
Define and describe a single page application.
And the next one.
Describe what AngularJS is and what it can do.
Yes. So mostly I'm just going to be talking about Angular as a whole. You're going to be working with Angular for the next 2 weeks. So I'm just really going to be describing all that it can do and just like a high level kind of whirlwind overview of everything. So this isn't like I do this and now you go do this. I do this and then like 2 weeks from now you can maybe kind of do this. So, but let's talk about it. So we already talked about model view controller, but here's like a nice little diagram to refresh your memory. Everyone reach into the sky. So if we look at this visually with boxes and arrows, we've got our view, which display what the user sees. The controller, which mediates between the model, and then the model, which in relation to the controller informs what the view should update and do. In Angular, their pattern is known as MVVM. So this is what gives us two-way data binding, which you might have heard of before, or one-way data binding in terms of React. But the idea is the view model mediates between the view and the model and keeps them in sync with two-way data binding. So we can write very little code that just says, okay, the model looks like this, the view looks like this, which represents the model. Now when anything changes, the view automatically updates. Or if anything in the UI changes, like somebody's inputting into an input box, the model will automatically update. The view model is what handles that for us. And it's just built into Angular. We really don't have to do much. In Angular, your model is known as a POJO, plain old JavaScript object. So you just create an object, put some properties on it, and it gets linked up and updates in real time. What's up?
Is the view model controlled by the controller, or is this instance the view model is the controller?
I would say the view model is controlled by the controller. Okay. So we'll have controllers, and then our view model, kind of like the glue, is known as scope, which eventually will be hidden from us. But yes, the controller is managing the view model, which updates the two.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. The other aspect of Angular is it being a single page application. So I talked a little bit about this, but the idea is instead of your page refreshing for every single page that you go to, you basically always are on the layout page, the home page that has the header and the footer. But then as your pages change, this middle section gets dynamically pulled in and out to reflect a different view. So if you've ever seen a single page application site, the URL doesn't really change, but then the fragment does change. A quick example of that, anyone here use Gmail? No? So take a look at the URL here, right? So it says that URL #inbox. But when I go to starred, that URL #starred. Or when I go to sent, that URL #sent. But you'll notice everything else remained exactly the same, right? I've got this bar over here, this over on the right. The only thing that's changing is this middle section right here. So that's being dynamically updated by JavaScript. So this is a single page application. Even though there are multiple pages, it's single page because we're loading multiple pages into the app itself. If you think of a single page application as a site that just scrolls a bunch and it's on a single page, that's not a single page application, that's a bad user experience. So, question, yeah?
This might be a little bit ahead, but is that because Angular uses states like React does, or is that?
It has more to do with just pulling different views in and out. So we'll talk about a route later, which is a mapping between a view and a controller. Basically, the router will say, when the URL changes, I want you to load this specific view and this specific controller. Yes?
Just so for understanding, what's the, it's already seems simpler as far as layout goes. but what's the benefit from there? Is like, that would have been my landing page, is my index.hbs, and then you could have still loaded the same stuff on there, and just had it set as the same template. What's the benefit of doing it single page?
Right, so if you think about, if you're using the same template, it's a totally different request that the browser has to make. And it's also like a repaint. So basically, your browser loads index.html, it has to render that out.
Right.
Then you go to page 2, which has the same header and footer, but if it's server-side rendered, you have to make that request all over again, and then it re-renders the header and re-renders the footer. In this case, and you might even be able to see it like in the DOM, the header and the footer are the exact same elements. The only elements that are changing is the middle section. So if we look at like the element inspector, we can probably see like what's going on over here.
Benefit would be less routes.
The benefit would be less requests, like less data that the server has to send, and honestly like less thinking that the server has to do. Because instead of like rendering the view, the server just spits back the JSON data immediately, and then the front end handles changing the view. That's kind of the other like fundamental switch we're making. Instead of rendering things on the server side, Angular is now rendering things on the front end using data. But let's say like when I
So is it not RESTful then? Like,
No, it is extremely RESTful. The API would be RESTful, not Angular. So the API that Angular is interfacing with would be a RESTful API. So get data, post data, delete data.
Well, I thought another part of that was the fact that the server doesn't need to know anything about, or no, the front end doesn't know anything, right? The server is telling it exactly what to render and really holds all the information.
Yeah, so it's a similar idea, but the front end doesn't have to know anything about like where the data is coming from. It just is saying, hey, API, give me that data. So it like doesn't have to know about the database or anything like that. So and definitely like RESTful routing actually came from like pure JSON APIs. So in your RESTful routing with server-side rendered, you have something like a route that is a GET request to view the edit page. With RESTful routing for pure JSON APIs, there are no routes that render a page, right? It's all routes that are just about data. So the actual view would happen from Angular, but it's not a part of the RESTful specification. I guess I was just going to show, what's the thing? Yeah, this. Okay, so watch this little div right here. It's like being dynamically updated and pulled out whenever I change. So I go here, and then JavaScript in the background is just changing those two little divs. Everything else stays the same.
And it's actually just changing it with classes.
Well, it is doing like actual DOM manipulation. I believe if I go here, yeah, like when you saw it collapse because it's literally removing it and re-adding it. Cool. All right, so you could build a single page application. You could do it from scratch, but there's a lot going on. So there is DOM manipulation. That is, you have data, you want to have it reflected in the view. There is object modeling. So you're getting data from an API, and you want that modeled in some way. You have history, so the history of what pages you've visited. So on Gmail, I could have pressed the back button, and it actually would have taken me to inbox, to sent. Like it's actually using the browser history API to kind of hijack that back button because we're on the same page always, but we still kind of have a history of pages switching in and out. Module loading or like loading libraries, doing things like AJAX and making API requests, doing the routing. All of these different things are things you would have to do if you were trying to build that single page application from scratch. But this is what Angular gives you. So I'm going to talk about what the features Angular has built into it, how to get started with Angular, how to add it to your app, the things you're going to hear a lot in Angular, directives, filters, and data binding, and then talk about views, controllers, and scope. And lastly, I may or may not have time to get in routes and services, but this is really going to be a higher level overview of how all these things work together. So AngularJS is a full-featured SPA framework. Is everyone here familiar with the difference between a library and a framework? Yes, can I get a volunteer maybe to differentiate? Yes.
Is a framework a little larger, I guess, whereas a library just has certain small tools you can use? A framework is something you build something in.
Yes, definitely. So library, you can think of like jQuery. Think of it does one thing and one thing well. jQuery does a couple of things. Like it does AJAX and it does DOM manipulation, but it does those things very well. If you wanted to do routing, if you wanted to do templating, you would have to pull in other libraries for that. So libraries are usually like very standalone, and you use like multiple libraries to help get things done. A framework has lots of things built into it, and pretty much if you're using a framework, depending on the type of framework, you don't really have to bring in any other libraries. Now, typically, we will for certain applications, because Angular is very modular. Like, parts of it are actually broken out into separate libraries. But Angular provides all of this out of the box. Like, you literally add one script tag, and you're getting all of this stuff. So we're getting data binding, which is like automatically syncing of the view. MVC. It has its own like mini version of jQuery built in if you really do need to do DOM manipulation. It has routing, templates, controllers, components, data validation, dependency injection, which I won't get too much into, factories, but all of these things are built into Angular. The moment you add it to your page, you have all of this already. So a framework is kind of more full-featured and gives you everything you need to get up and going.
Quick question on this.
Yeah.
So, the framework also like kind of add additional new syntax on top of an existing language, and like you also need like your own, like if you built a file, it would have its own file extension too.
So not all frameworks are that way. So you're going to be learning is Angular that does not require any special file types or anything like that. That said, there is special syntax that you add to your HTML that a browser would not understand if Angular was not loaded on the page.
But in the library, it would just be like a custom pre-built method or function.
Yes, but at the same time, React is very much considered a library because it's kind of just the view in Model View Controller. If you want to add the other things to React, you have to actually bring in other libraries. But React has a special JSX syntax, and it needs different types of files. So there, the lines get a little bit blurred. So I won't say specific file types and new syntax is specific to a framework because libraries can do that also. Yes.
So I know React is like independent of the rest of the app almost, and how you can like use any other framework or library with it. Is Angular the same way, or will it like?
Yeah. So the fact that Angular is a framework is it's not. Like there are strategies for like, okay, I only want Angular on this one section of my site. You can do that. But often when people choose Angular, it's for the whole site. It's not for like a small section or something like that. Cool. All right, getting started. You know what? I don't even know if this link is going to work. Because, okay, this is it. Because you might have heard like Angular 3, 2, 4. Like Angular 2 is a totally separate framework from Angular 1. It has the same name, but totally different syntax, totally different way of doing things. We're going to be learning Angular 1.6 specifically. So when you're looking for documentation, when you're looking at the website, you want to go to angularjs.org. If you go to angular.io, this is all about Angular 4, the latest version. So if you're trying to find resources here, you're going to be very confused because it's using TypeScript and lots of other stuff. We are using Angular 1.6, so make sure you're on this documentation. That also applies like when you're searching the web for resources. You want to specify Angular 1, like Angular 1.6 when you're looking for tutorials and help for things, because everything for Angular 2 and above is very like disjointed and like it's all over the place. So we are learning specifically Angular 1.6.
CJ, can you,
Yeah.
just out of curiosity, why are we learning 1.6, and then what's the difference between 2, 3, and 4?
Sure. So 1.6 is probably there's more Angular 1 code out there than really anything else. Now, I'm sure you've heard a lot about React, like it's this hot new framework, and there are a lot of job postings that have React in them. But specifically, Angular has all of the same concepts that you would learn in those other frameworks. So like one of the main reasons is you're going to learn concepts. If you do want to learn those other frameworks, you can move on to that as well. The other reason is because it's like very prevalent in industry. That said, like there is like a shift right now. Basically, Angular 1.6 is being considered legacy. Like no new apps really are being built with 1.6. If they decide to build a new app, they're going to be choosing like Angular 4 or React or something like that. But that said, it's really because it teaches the concepts, and there's a lot of legacy Angular 1 code out there. So you definitely could get a job where you're working in Angular 1. But the way we're teaching it and the way you'll see it very much transfers over if you're trying to learn other frameworks. Cool. Question?
No.
Cool. So getting started, you can click this download AngularJS. It is just like any other JavaScript library you're adding to your page, like jQuery or something like that. So I am just going to take this URL right here and add it to my page. So yeah, let's do that. I'm going to create an index.html file. Open it up in Atom. And then create an HTML document. And then down here in the body, I'm going to add that script tag.
TJ, for me, it's they've actually blocked out my ability to copy that TDN library URL. Have you seen that?
Have not seen that. It might be a browser extension that you have. Well, you'll see that little icon, but you should still be able to copy it. Also, if you go to CDN.js, you could find it there too. Look for angular.js. Yeah, and you want to make sure that you're pulling in the 1.6 branch. In this case, we're using 1.6.4. So I have added Angular into this page. I have now enabled Angular on my page. It's as simple as that. Let's move on in the slide deck. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about directives, filters, and data binding. So the first thing are directives. Directives are a way to teach HTML new tricks. So the first directive you will see and learn about is ng app. So up here on the HTML tag, I'm just going to say ng app. Now, if you're following along, don't, because I'm going to be doing a lot of stuff and you're not going to be able to follow along, and then you're going to lose me, so just don't. Watch what I'm doing. I'll share the code afterwards, but yes, just watch. So this right here is known as a custom directive, an Angular directive. Now, by adding that directive to HTML, I have actually enabled this entire app to speak Angular, right? I'm using this directive. But there are a lot of other built-in directives. So let's see what else I was going to talk about. Yeah, so let's do this. Right here in the body, I'm just going to add a main tag. And I'm going to use this other directive called ng-init. And what this allows me to do is specify some initial data. So I'm going to do something like message equals hello G46. And then now, inside of here, I'm just going to let's add like an H3. And in here, I can actually use handlebars syntax. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw the handlebars in and say, right here inside of this H3, I want you to show the value of message. And just like that should work. So let's start it up. Hello G46, right? Pretty freaking amazing. Okay, but it gets better than that. It gets better than that. First, let me just pull in Bootstrap so I can get some basic styling.
So, but I'm sure it gets more complicated. Why didn't you just write hello G46? It seems like a lot.
It does seem like that'd be a better way to do it, but I will show you. Let's do Slate. Yeah, so we're and that, like all these little examples, they're going to build on each other, and I'm going to show you like why you would even need that. Okay, so sure that says hello, but let's do this. So right here, I'm going to create. Let's do it above it. I'm going to create a form, the class of form. It's a Bootstrap thing, and then I'm going to create a form group. This is going to say name, for name, and then the input. We'll just leave it like that. But here's what I want to happen. So down here, I want this to say hello name. And then we'll get rid of our ng-init for now. So when I refresh the page, I have this form up top, and it just says hello. Let me add a container class. It'll look a little nicer.
To do this any other way, you would have had to done this on already 2 separate pages.
Well, and so the other thing to mention, I have not written a single line of JavaScript yet, right?
Yeah.
I've only added HTML elements to the page, and it's kind of just working.
Yeah.
So now let's talk about data binding. So this is the idea of binding something in the view to the model. So automatic synchronization of data between the model and view components. So right here on this input, I'm going to give it another directive, ng model. And what this allows me to do is it says, okay, for this input, I want you to bind its value to something on the model, to something in what I'm going to call scope. So if right here I put name, we've now created a little variable behind the scene called name that whenever I type into this input box, that name variable will be updated with what I'm typing. So because of data binding, when I type into this input box, this view down here will automatically update and render as I type into the input box. So with code, just like that. Hello, G46.
Damn.
Oh, You can clap. It's, yeah. So this is the power of Angular. Like, and the other thing to mention, I have not written a single line of JavaScript, right? Like, I'm just adding these little attributes, these little directives that adds kind of that interactivity to the page. Yeah, go for it.
I was going to say, so ng model name relates to the handlebars name, but does it also have to correspond to the label before? You just put a name up there and say that's what it's
Oh yeah, this is totally separate from the actual HTML itself. And right now, I'm doing kind of everything in line. I'm going to show you how we're going to like pull this out into components. We're going to make it more modular. But for now, kind of just showing you, yeah, like you can just put that on there. But this totally bound to the model itself, not bound to like the name of the form or anything like that.
You say model, which we use as the data, right?
Yes.
Talking about. And so right now, are you writing the controls, or
Yeah, at this point, I don't have a controller
Okay.
because I'm kind of just using data binding to my advantage. So the idea is I have this name property on the model, and I'm using it in the view, but I don't really need a controller because at this point, they're just staying in sync.
Okay.
The controller would do things like manipulate the model in a more specific way that you can't exactly do with the UI, like custom JavaScript logic. So yes, and I'll add a controller soon. The next thing to look at are filters. So a filter formats the value of an expression for display to the user. Now these can be extremely powerful, but let's look at something like an array filter. So on here, I'm going to do ng init, and I'm going to create a variable called books. It's going to be an array that has some books in it. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Let's also add Harry Potter. And you don't know JS. Cool, so I've got some books. I'm going to change this input box to be a search instead. So I'm going to say search and ng model search. Before I show filtering, I'm going to show another really cool directive. So right here below this form, I'm just going to add a, let's do an h4. And in here, I'm going to use the ng repeat directive. So ng repeat. Now what this takes is a collection or an array of some kind. So I'm going to say, hey Angular, please repeat each book inside the books array. So for each book in books, I then want you to display the book title. So just like that, to go to the page, we now see all the titles of the book. So let's look at that compared to the code. So this is like where I'm initializing the data on the model, a variable called books that has the value inside of the array. Then I'm saying, I want you to create an h4 for every single book inside of that book array. Then book becomes equal to each string on each iteration of the loop. So it becomes that, then that, then that. Yes?
Is the book in books, if you put like things in books?
Yes, that would work too.
Anything.
Okay. It's
Jeez.
just looking at the in books.
You're giving it a variable name for each value inside of the array. Yeah, and that's totally custom.
But books does need to be in books, doesn't need to be books, right?
Yes, so this right here must correspond to an array or collection on your model. Cool. Okay, so we've got the book in books. Now let's talk about filters. It's as simple as saying filter on search. So now, anything I type into the input box will automatically filter what is displayed in the repeat below it. So just with like that, I can click right here and type things in, and it filters down. So if we look at how this is working, so filter is a built-in filter to Angular. It's just called filter. We can create our own custom filters. Like we could create a filter that sorts it by age or date, or that only displays first on something. But this is built into the language, and I'm saying filter on the search value that is on the scope inside of the model. So basically, as this updates, because our view is data bound, as search updates, this ng repeat automatically updates to only display the things that match that. Pretty cool stuff. All right, what else I got?
So why is it showing all of them when there's nothing in search?
So it defaults to, like, when search is empty, filter is empty, so display all. And
You can override that.
yeah, you could write custom logic that says, like, if search is empty, display nothing. Yeah, you're totally in control if you wanted to do that.
And that would be a controller?
That would be a filter. we're almost to controllers. Cool. So that's kind of all the interaction. This is the stuff that's happening inside of your view. Now I'm going to talk about how we kind of like start to pull these things out to make our app more modular, to make it more maintainable and have separation of concerns. So this scope variable, that is the view model. So when I did ng model equals search or ng init books, I'm actually defining a variable on the model that scope will now keep updated. So if search ever changes, it changes in the view. If books ever changes, that changes in the view. So $scope is the keyword you'll see. We put data on that, and it keeps the two in sync. Now I'm going to talk about when we're using components and what you'll learn in the curriculum, you actually won't see much of $scope. You're just going to see the view model and $control. But it's still there, it's just hidden from you. We'll talk about that. So $scope is the glue or the view model between a controller and a view. So let's pull this out into a controller and view. So right in here, I'm going to create a new file, just call it app.js. Inside of here, I'm going to create a new module. The module defines where all of my controllers, my services, my filters are going to be inside of. You could have multiple modules inside of your app. You could have like the homepage module and the inventory module and whatever other feature module. You can basically split up your code into these modules so everything stays separate. Now, when you first get started, pretty much all of your app is going to be in one module, but you'll see other ways of doing it where you can split it out into more and more.
This is all like having route files, like different route files.
Yes, so like different route files, but it's really like different functionality of the site, like all wrapped up into different modules. Because each module could have multiple controllers. I guess similar to a route, you have multiple route handlers, or like a route file has multiple route handlers. So to create a module, you say angular.module. And in here, you pass in the name of your module. So I'm going to call this books app. The second parameter is an array of dependencies that your app has. Now, right now, I have no dependencies, so I'm just going to leave it blank. You'll read in the curriculum, you'll see about it, like this defines a new module. If you leave this off, it gets access to an existing module, but don't have to worry about that for now. So I've defined the module. Now inside of my Angular app, I need to update the ng app directive. So over here, ng app blank, that just means like just one giant module with no name on it and like no JavaScript files. So right here, if I say ng app equals books app, now I'm specifically saying everything that is a descendant of this element can use the features and controllers and views inside of books app. So ng app books app corresponds to the module. The next thing I'm going to do is create a controller. So this is going to be a controller that kind of has the data inside of it. So instead of using this directive like ng init, we're actually going to have JavaScript code that creates that array. So right here, I'm going to say .controller. We give it a name. Let's call it books controller. Controller. And right here, we give it a function. I'm just going to call the function books controller as well. Know what you're thinking? Where's that function? It's right here. Okay, so I have now defined a controller. A controller is just a function. Are you familiar with constructor functions, like creating an instance of a function? That's totally fine. Angular is doing that under the hood for you. But the idea is you have access to put things on itself because it's going to create an instance. Doesn't matter though. Okay, so here's what I want to do. Instead of having this books defined in the HTML, because that's really ugly and like you're mixing JavaScript and HTML, let's pull this out. So instead of doing ng init, I'm going to say ng-controller equals books controller. And now everything that's a descendant of the body has access to things inside of that controller. So now on the controller, I'm going to add this up here just kind of as a comment. I need to create a books variable that you can then access inside of that controller. So the way we do this is by putting it on scope. So you declare scope on the controller, that's going to be injected in, and now we can put values on scope. So here I'm going to say $scope.books equals this thing. And so now, when the app loads up, the code that's inside of this controller has access to a variable called books because it's put on scope. So now this ng repeat should work exactly the same way, except I've just abstracted things out into a separate file. Jules?
How does it know, in Up until now, we've called the app.js file somewhere in the script tag on our HTML. Have we done that?
We have not, and we need to. Yeah, so definitely we have to bring our code in.
Okay.
And just like when you were doing like jQuery, your code should come after the library. So
Yeah, I wasn't sure. If there was, like, magic
No, it's-
name
no
or
magic, no
something
magic.
to do with that.
yeah, so our code needs to be pulled in, and now this should actually work. But the idea is on this tag right here, it has access to all the values that are on the scope in Books controller. So when the app loads, Books is going to be equal to this array. So I'm going to go back. Looks exactly the same, but now we've pulled that code out into JavaScript instead. Yes?
When you were writing scope.books, is that how you're always going to write that variable? So it's going to be scope and then dot the name of what you want to call it?
Yes, but let's go ahead and just change that now because the way you're going to learn it in the curriculum is not that way. So the way we create components. It actually does it for us. But you can have this controller as thing. And the idea of a controller as is you're giving a name to the controller so it's a little more apparent. So right now, you see the word books.
Right.
And it's just kind of floating there. But what we can do is we can give the controller a name. So let's say books controller as, we'll say $control. And so now, instead of just seeing books, we'll do $control.books. And right here, we'll do $control.search and $control.search. Now, I believe I'm going to have to make some updates in my JavaScript, but let's see what happens. Yeah, so the books go away. The idea is, instead of using this scope model, we just put things on this. So we'll create a variable, call it VM, and set it equal to this. So VM stands for view model. And now instead of saying $scope.books, I'll just say VM.books. And so now VM in the controller corresponds to $control in the view. So we've kind of, instead of having those floating variables, we've put it behind a controller, and now we can actually access them just like that. This is how it's going to be in the apps that you build. You won't have to specify this explicitly. It's kind of doing that under the hood for you. But get used to seeing $control. Get used to putting things on the VM. And now the app works.
This is entirely off.
Yeah, go for it.
What is Bootswatch?
Oh, it's just styles for Bootstrap.
Is it like for Bootstrap? Or is it like
Yeah. It's straight up Bootstrap, but they have default styles like this. So so I chose the slate theme. All the same Bootstrap classes, but you get this default coloring.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and they have a bunch of other ones. Filters. Okay, let's talk about. Oh, go for it.
No, I just was wondering why we will be doing it the second way and not the first way.
This is like the old way. Like you'll read about and hear about John Papa's style guide. The idea is while Angular is a framework and it has all these things built in, there are a lot of different ways that you could actually implement it. So one Angular code base might not look exactly the same as another. It might be doing different things. John Papa's style guide was basically, after several years of like chaos, he came up with, okay, these are industry best practices. Like I've been doing Angular for years now. If you follow this, you'll run into less bugs. Like this is the way to do it. So this is a way to run into less bugs. You'll learn about scope and inherited scope and stuff like that. But the idea is by having everything on our controller behind a variable, we won't even run into a whole class of bugs that you would have before. But that's pretty much it. It's like a style guide that people agreed that, hey, this is the best way to do it.
Can we see your JS app.js real quick?
Yeah, definitely. Let's split it right.
If you went back to the scope on your other one and had it the way you did, and left control there, is that still going to function the same?
It wouldn't. Yeah, so it broke when I did that. Because the idea is once you're using controller as, you need to put things on this.
Okay.
So this corresponds to the function itself. Basically, you're putting variables and properties onto that value. Yeah?
Sorry.
No, go for it.
So, if you wanted to do a second function, would it still be VM equals this, or would it be something else?
If we were going to be calling the function, I could do like a really quick example of that. So let's say, let's just do like a simple counter. So like right above the form, let's have a button that says increase. And then right above the button, I'll have a stretch. Okay, so I'll have up here just like an H3 that has, let's do a $control.count. And so now in here, I'll say vm.count equals 0. But here's what I want to happen. every time this button is clicked, increase the count by 1. So what I'm going to do is we have this nice ng-click directive. So say ng-click $control.increase count. And so now I can define a function in my controller called increase count that will increment the count. So
is that like, is the increase like just built-in method? And then
nope, I'm about to define it. Yeah. So right here, I'm just going to say VM. Well, actually, like usually the way you do it is you define this function, and then up here you would say VM.increaseCount equals increase count. So basically, I'm specifying that function and putting it on the VM. And then right here, I'm going to say VM.count++. And I don't need to return anything because the moment I modify the view model, the view will instantly update, right? So this will instantly update. Question?
So every view function or ng function you do will go inside that main body control or both controller function. So I mean that's going to be like the main one, and then if you want to do things like that, you put it within the function.
Right, yeah, and inside of here, you could call other functions, like if you are pulling in like Lodash or something like that, you could use those methods inside of here. This increase count is specific to this controller, so I'm defining it inside of here. If it was reusable, I might actually pull it out elsewhere.
You could only do it on that.
Yeah, because this is only going to exist inside of this controller. So if it's something that you need to use across controllers, you might put it in a service instead. We'll talk about that though.
But doesn't everything for the book controller in the body, so it all has scope of everything it does?
Yeah, it does. We will talk about though, like you typically will have more than just one component.
Right.
So like right now it's like one controller for my whole app. You're going to have a controller for like every page that gets rotated in and out. So.
And we've defined it as the $control, and that's why when we're making those function calls, we're using that, right? $control.count.
Exactly. So and you can one-to-one $control in the HTML is equal to VM in the controller. So VM.increaseCount, same thing as $control.increaseCount. Yes.
Kind of on Michelle's question, so you just said we'll have different controllers for different parts of the site.
Mhm.
So will those be in different files, or will they be just different functions within that?
You can put them in separate files, but the idea with this .controller is you can use that same syntax and say, like right here, just do like define it in line like this, and then have all those same functions inside of this file. It's usually not a good practice because then you have like 1,000 lines of like a bunch of controller files. So I could create a separate file that creates the controller just in that file. Actually, I'll just go ahead and do that. So let's say books controller. I'll do books.controller.js. And then inside of here, I'm going to pull this whole thing out. I'll show you what we need. And let's rename this too. So app is just going to be app.module.js. And then books controller is going to have this, but instead of defining the module. So remember how I mentioned this second parameter defines the module? If I remove that, now we're just getting access to the module. So this is saying, get this existing module, which was defined in another file, and add this controller to it.
So it's like module X.
In a way, yeah. It's like a way of doing it without having all that. So now I need to bring this in here. So I'll bring in app.module, and then below it, I'll bring in books.controller.js. And now it should behave exactly the same way, but it's now separated into separate files. Okay, we were talking about the increase count. What will happen when I click this button?
It's plus, right?
Count plus plus, yeah. See, look at that. Wow! And let's look how that's working. So this thing is bound to the count variable. When this thing is clicked, it runs this function.
Right.
Inside of this function, we increment count. So because the thing is bound to it, it's going to get the latest value every time.
And if you log count right now, would you get the current 11 or whatever every time you click?
Yeah, so in the JavaScript world, it is the latest value for sure. Yeah, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about components. Now, a component is basically a way to take the view, the controller, the scope, and everything and bundle it up into a thing that has a name. Okay? So we're taking that controller and that view that I created, and we're going to put it into its own custom tag. So if you remember from earlier, it's an atomic UI piece that is composable and reusable. So once I put this book list into a component, I could use book list all throughout my app and have access to everything that entails. So let's do it. So right here, I'm going to create a new file. Actually, I'll do it in the app.module. So right here, I'm going to say .component. And I'm going to give it a name. Here, I'm going to do book list. Now, you'll read about components. This, when I use it in the HTML, gets converted to dash case. In JavaScript, it's camel case, but we'll see what that means. So a component takes an object that has two properties. The first is template. I'm going to do template. Yeah, we'll just do template for now. And here I'll just have like an H1 book list. And it also has a controller property. So here I'm just going to put the name of the controller, books controller. So now I have defined a component called book list where the template looks like this and its controller is that. Real quick, I'm going to create a book list.html. We're not using it just yet, but I basically want to take, and actually let's move this controller. Basically, this whole div was this controller. All that. So basically, I'm taking the thing that represents that books controller view and pulling it out into a separate file. So boom, gone. And now it's going to exist inside of here. And inside of here, I don't have to specify controller because it'll do that for me. So I've basically taken that view, that one section that represents the book list, and pulled it out into this separate file. So right now, the component is defined as book list with that template. So in the HTML, right here, I'm just going to say book-list. And so I have encapsulated all of that functionality into a small component. So right now, the template just says an H1. In a second, I'm going to pull in all of that other functionality. So if I go back, did I lose it? Book list. So that little component brought in its template, which was just the H1. But now, instead of a template, I can say template URL. And right here, I can specify its template URL is booklist.html. So now, when Angular sees this tag, it's going to pull in this template. It's going to initialize it with this controller, and then we'll get all of the same functionality we had before. And I broke it. What happened? Oh,
Template URL, R and L are lower.
cool. Yeah, thanks. Sweet. So exact same functionality as before, but now we're modular, right? We have like a nice little component.
Is this a partial?
Yeah. So you would consider this to be a partial. It is a view, but at the same time, it's just like part of the app. Absolutely. Yeah, it's like all these things, like it makes everything easier, but you had to learn the hard way first. You got to learn how it works, and yeah. Because under the hood, this is just doing DOM manipulation. It's just everything that you could do with jQuery, it's doing that, but it's now packed it into nice little directives and stuff. So got this handy dandy component, and I could use this anywhere. So I could throw this, and now I have like 4 book lists on the page. Boom, boom, boom. Right? You can reuse it anywhere on your site.
That would be making the Reddit clone like fucking like nothing.
You're going to have to make a Reddit clone with Angular, so
Oh,
yeah.
okay. There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, nothing. That's like nothing.
Okay, so I've been talking for a while. I'm going to finish with routes and services, and then that should be it. So this kind of like brings it all together. So this is kind of how you can view the hierarchy of an Angular app. You have at the highest most level a module. This contains everything else inside of it. So the views, the controllers, the services, everything else is inside of that module. I'll talk a bit about the config function. This is basically the function that runs the very first time when your app starts up. And this is where we're going to be defining routes and basically configuring our app before it starts up. Now, a route matches a view and a controller. Matches a URL to a view and a controller. So when the URL changes, it decides to put in a specific view or put in a specific controller. Views can use directives. We've seen some of the built-in directives. You can also create your own directive. Like this component that I created is basically a custom directive. Component is just a wrapper around directives. It's directives with sensible defaults. But I've basically created a custom directive right here, and you could do the same anywhere else in your app. But this is it kind of at a high level. What we're going to be doing is routing to components. So you define your routes and you say, when the URL changes, load this specific component. When it's this URL, load this specific component. So let's do that. So for this, I'm going to use UI router. Yes, so UI router is a totally separate library. It's not built from Angular, but it allows you to add routes into your application. So this is the one that we're going to be using. It's like the industry standard. Angular does have its own, you can look at additional modules. They do have their own router, Angular route, but pretty much everyone uses UI router. It has a lot more built-in features. It has, you can keep track of state. You can have nested views. It's a lot more powerful, so we use that instead. When you're getting it, you're going to want to make sure that you're getting at least version 1. Version 1 is the one that supports component routing. If you get an older version, you're going to set up your routes. Nothing will happen. You'll debug it for days. Get version 1 at least. So I've got the script tag. I'm going to bring it in after Angular. And now I have UI router available inside of my app. So earlier I mentioned this dependency list. This is where you tell Angular, hey, I want to use those external libraries. So right here, I'm going to do UI.router. Anybody know? It's either UI.router or UI-router.
I think it's dash, but
Okay, let's see. But basically, I could look at their docs. I guess I'll do that.
yeah, it's pretty.
So this is like writing in your JSON file or the dependencies that would be a part of it.
Exactly. So you still have to bring them into this file,
Right.
but here you're saying, okay, inside of this module, I want access to the directives and everything available inside of that module.
I would say this is closer to a require statement.
Okay.
It's like you could npm install, but that doesn't mean it's in your application.
It was a dot. I was right.
No, you weren't.
That's cool. Okay, UI.router. So this just basically says my module can now use the features of UI router. So now I also need to configure the app. So I'll do .config. This will take in a function called config. So down here I'll just say like function config. This function is the first thing that runs when the app loads. So right here I'm just going to log hello from Angular. And when the app loads, we should see that in the dev tools. Hello from Angular. That's literally like the first line of our code that's going to run. So inside of this config function is where we set up the routes. So if I look here, state provider, it is what is provided by UI router to create states and routes inside of our app. So on the config function, you just specify state provider, and now when the app loads, you have access to it to create states. So this is known as dependency injection. Basically, you don't even have to worry about where it's coming from. Angular is going to create one for you and pass it in. But you specify it there, and now we can use it. So we can do, actually, I don't need the state provider, do I? Yeah. So I'll say state provider dot state. And what I want is a state where the name is home. And I guess I could just do, yeah, let's just do template. And the template is just a button that goes to the books page. So I'm going to copy this button just for sake. And I can use backtick, so we can use like new lines. And in here, I'm going to say the URL is slash. So when the URL is slash, load this home template, I'll do lowercase home, that is just a button that says go to books. So let's do this. So now, instead of book list, I'm going to use UI-view. The idea is this is kind of like the X marks the spot. So all the views that you create with components will be injected into that section right there. So now that I've said the state with the slash URL is home, when the app loads, I think I'll have to do // let's do the otherwise. I think we have it in here. There's this other thing you can inject called URL router provider. And in here you can say .otherwise /. So if the route doesn't match, go to /. There we go. Quick stretch. I'm almost done.
I was gonna say, like, I don't see anywhere where you set up like going to a local host or anything like that, or like going to an actual index page.
Oh, like Yeah, so I have an HTTP server running inside of that folder. So yeah, like you could just do HTTP-server, and it's going to be serving index.html by default.
That's okay.
And that's all it requires. Yeah, I'm using a light server, which automatically like refreshes the page and does stuff like that. So, but okay, so I have told the router, and if we look at the URL up here, you'll notice that fragment, right? That hash. So the idea is anything that's after the hash will define new routes and new components that we can go to. So I want to go to the books route when I click on this button. So let's do this. Let's create another state. So I'm going to say, let's do this right off of here. Let's say .state. In this case, the name will be book list. Let's just call it books. And here, I'm just going to say the component. The component is book list.
It's the same that you have above, right? On top?
Yes, so this component name should match whatever the component is called when you defined it. So basically this says, and then I need to specify URL. So let's say when the URL is /books, load this component into that section, into this UI view right here. So here, I can do a UI-sref. So this stands for UI state reference. And in here, I can reference when this button is clicked, what state do you want to go to? In this case, I want to go to the books state. So when this button is clicked, change the URL to be /books, which will then load the book list component. And just like that, books. Yeah, and watch. Thank you. But watch the URL, right? So it /nothing/books/nothing/books. So you can define any number of states, use UI-sref in your code to get those different states and go to them.
Does the UI-sref automatically add the slash after that? Is that what that's doing?
Yeah, totally. So I could do this manually. I could say, change it to an anchor tag and say href equals hash, hash bang /books. And if I did this and refresh the page, now you'll see when I hover over it, it actually has that href,
Right.
and that'll work in exactly the same way. Yep.
And if you were to hit that increase button a few times, go back and then try and hit those again, will it reload it or will it completely save it?
Goes away. So because every time the view is swapped in and out, that controller gets totally discarded. So every time we go into this books controller, brand new data, like brand new, totally new. Cool. Yeah, that's routes and components. I do want to talk about services though. So in your front-end coding world, you probably have used $.ajax to make requests, right? You've done like $.get some URL and then use the data that came back from it. Built into Angular is $HTTP. And this is basically Ajax, and it has all the functions built into it. So like get, post, anything else you want to do to an API. So let's do this. So when the app first loads, I'm just going to set books equal to the empty string. I'm then going to say $HTTP.get, and here I have a JSON URL of some books. And then I'm going to say, so this is promise-based, so I can just say .then. This will give me back the books, and then I can log out the books. So let's see what we get back. Cool. We got an object. It has a data property, which also has a data property that is the array. So I want books to be equal to, what did I call this? Let's call this result. So I want books to be equal to result.data.data. Let's see what that is. Okay, so result.data.data is the books itself. So now, inside of this .then, I'll say vm.books equals result.data.data. Well, it's going to look ugly, but just initially, we're getting the JSON object for each individual book. So now I want the book title. So in the view, instead of just rendering out the book, I'll render out book.title. There we go.
What do you mean? So what's a service? What is services, CJ?
Yes. So the idea that it is hiding complexity from you. So $HTTP is the service that got injected, and it And it has like the get method, the post method, and stuff like that. I'm going to go one step further and pull it out into my own service. So one thing you'll see is controllers need to be like as simple as possible. They should just be managing data. They shouldn't be doing things like making API requests. So I could create my own custom service that has a method like get books. I call that, and then that immediately returns this, and I don't even have to know like result.data.data or anything. So let's do this. We'll do books.service. Actually, I'll do a factory. Factory and services are the exact same thing. They're just created in different ways. So here I'll get a reference to the module, books app. And then on it, I will define a new factory. We'll call it books service. A factory is just a function that returns an object. So I'm going to define a function called book service that returns an object. That object will have various things that are available inside of the controller. So I want to get access to a function called get books. So get books is going to be a function that then ultimately gets access to the books. So over here in the controller, I'm going to pull out this code. Instead of $HTTP, I'm going to say books service. Right here, I'm going to say books service.getBooks.then. That should give us the books, and then I'll say vm.books equals books. Now our service will actually do the dirty work, right? It's going to make the API request, and instead of setting on the VM, it's just going to return the data that's required of it. Now services can have things injected to them just like other things, so I'm going to inject $HTTP. So now this service has one property on it, get books. So now in any other controller, I can inject that service, and I have instant access to get books. So I'm like removing some of the complexity of the controller, and now any other controller that needs that can just pull in the service and call that function. Yeah?
You're talking about Angular being powerful in that $HTTP. Is that one of the things that it brings to the table that would be something you have to install like someone else with React?
Exactly. So with React, they don't have that built in, so you'd have to use a library like Axios or like the built-in fetch. So yeah, with React, you're pulling in a lot of other stuff to get things going. Angular has it all built in.
Cool, right on.
Yeah.
So in order to call upon books on any other view, we call book service .get books because we're saying that like that service page and the function within it.
Exactly. And we could write more functions that like have custom logic, like if I've already made the API request, return it instead. But right now, anytime somebody calls that, it's going to make a new API request. But as simple as that. Now the should work exactly the same way or not. Oh, I need to bring in the book service. So in index.html, right here, let's do a script, books.service, or I called it factory. There we go. So same functionality, we've just put it in a service instead. All right. Yes?
Really quick.
Yeah.
So HTTP in the file or
The factory?
yes, factory file, so you don't have to require that at the top, like just because it's required on the HTML page, that's enough it needs to be put?
So this is known as dependency injection. So the idea is anytime you're defining a function for a factory or a function for a controller or function for a directive or a component, this parameter here can be anything that's available to you. So the idea is under the hood, when Angular creates a new book service, it actually creates an instance of HTTP and just passes it in. But by simply putting that there, that's all you have to do. That is known as dependency injection. Basically, it does some fancy things where it like looks what the name of it is. If it sees it, it'll create an instance and pass it in. But this is basically like a require statement. It's like, I am dependent on this thing. Angular will give it to you. Yes, and then in talking about routing, like URLs match views and controllers, in our case components. I think I want to build out real quick just like a better template than this just to show what's possible. I could even do like a subcomponent. I've already been up here too long. Let's do, okay, so for each book, I want it to be a div. And then each div should be a row. And then inside of that div, it should be a column S4 4. Is this how you do it in Bootstrap?
Yeah, that.
Like that? Like that?
No,
SM. Cool. Okay, and that will have like the image, and then I'll have another column. What's 12 minus 4? 8. Cool. Dash 8. Okay, so up here I'm going to have an image tag. The source is going to be book.image, I believe. I don't know. Let's log out the whole book, and we'll see what the properties are. Over on this side, I'll have like an H3 that's book.title. That didn't work. In the factory, no, in the controller, let's just log books. Cover URL, huh. Okay. Book.cover_URL. So there is this custom directive ng source. Anytime you're binding the source to something, you want to use that because it'll wait until everything's loaded before it tries to make a request to like some weird URL. Question?
Well, I was saying there's no each anymore. Like this is doing it multiple times, but there's no like each data or any type of saying like we're using for handlebars.
Oh, well, that happens in the ng repeat. The idea being that book is now going to correspond to each individual book.
So that's what repeat's doing?
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. And also, let's give this a class of image responsive. Yeah, what do we got? Whoa, okay. Why is it so big? Excess? Oh, that's why, yeah. Maybe. Yeah, there we go. Sweet. Nice little books. We could throw some extra small, because my page, my view was small enough that it didn't. Inside of here, we also have the description, so we'll have like a p tag, and then we'll do book.description. Look at that. We'll have, what's that? We'll have, what else? I guess we could have the genre. We could list out the authors. Yeah, let's do this. We'll have like a nested ng repeat. Okay, so right here below the title, I'm going to have, I don't know, an H4 tag that says authors. Right here, I'm going to have a span that repeats. So I'll do ng-repeat. I want to repeat the author in book.authors. And right here, I'll just throw the author. It's like that. And so I want first name and last name. So let's do author.firstname. And then space author.last name. Cool. Author, Kyle Simpson, Kyle Simpson, Kyle Simpson. This gets weird because we have like, maybe we want like commas or something. Not going to worry about that. But this is Angular. Oh yeah, and searching now works. And the cool thing about ng filter is so before it was just the titles of the books. Now this is searching over the authors, the description, everything else just by default. Just by doing that, it's looking at every single property on that object when it does the filter. Like if I search for Downey, that pops up.
What was that?
Filter. So the fact that I'm doing filter on the search box, that automatically looks at all of the properties inside of book.
Even if the properties aren't visible on the page?
Yes.
Because you have access to that object.
Yes.
Jesus Christ.
And I guess I could put a space after. I could put a comma there, but then when there's only one.
Yeah, how would you, so not to get too much into it, but how would you handle, would
Like-
that be in your component, or how would you handle moving through things in certain instances?
Yeah. So in this case, I might just do an ng.
Controller, I mean?
I'll do an ng if. So this is getting like really ugly, but let's do this. So ng if is another directive. It will render something if something else is true. So right here, I basically want to render this comma if the index is not the last index. So I'll create a span with a comma and a space. And this should only show up if $index, so stretch. We're doing it, guys. We're angularing. We're almost done. So when...
You're building galvanized reason in 5 minutes.
So $index is like a built-in keyword. You can use $index inside of any ng repeat. So I'll say if $index is equal to book.authors.length.
And it knows
If-
you're talking about books.authors, the index of books.authors.
This
Oh, you
index,
just said it.
so this index corresponds to the index in the thing I'm repeating over. So $index dot right here is equal to each index in the authors array. $index outside of it would be each index in the books array.
Something to keep a note is that this stuff looks like JavaScript. It's not. It kind of, sort of, maybe is JavaScript, but it's their Angular invented it.
Yeah, they're called Angular expressions because basically Angular will evaluate this expression against the current scope, which you'll get into, but the current scope is what variables are available to this specific element. So this says, if the index is not equal to the last index, show a comma. So now, comma disappeared, but we see a comma there.
Where the dash, what's -1? Saying that's.
Oh, well, because if length is 1
Okay.
and the index is 0, length -1 would be 0, and I don't want, when length is 1, I don't want to see that comma.
Okay.
I love how you said that this was gonna get messy, and it's like 40 words.
Yeah, you're saying that you would just put that in a different page, like you would put what you've written there into a different, like. control.
Yeah.
I think that what he would really do is probably create his own filter or directive.
Yeah. Let's.
Which is
No,
not necessarily.
I'm gonna do it, guys. I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna pull this into a separate component. Let's do it. Okay. So right here, because that way I can just say book, right?
Right.
And then I could say like book or like data equals book. I'm not gonna do it. I'm done talking. But like you get components, right? I could create a brand new component that has all of this inside of it, and then I could reuse that book component elsewhere. Cool.
And that's really more of a partial.
Yes, because it's like
That's a true partial.
it's a partial of a
They're all
view.
partial.
They really
Right,
are.
but that's a true partial that like you would use.
Yeah, but like for this app, I might have the books page, I might have like the favorites page. Each one of those is still a partial, but at the same time, it's like the higher level view. And then they might have nested components, which also have partials. So
This is so dope.
it's great. It's the best thing ever. Yeah. So as I mentioned, like when the URL changes, that's swapping out what component goes there. That is it. That's all I had for you. Yes, I would like you to think for 10 seconds, what is AngularJS and what can it do? All right, let's get some volunteers. What is AngularJS in your own words?
The framework that does black magic.
That's a good way to put it. I will add though, once you understand the magic, it's extremely powerful. And that's really the thing you're fighting against when you're first learning it is like it's doing so many things for you that it's hard to figure out, okay, when should I be doing this manually versus like letting Angular do it. But once you get used to everything, like it's just smooth sailing. It's pretty awesome. Somebody else, yeah.
Like modularized front end with a lot of built-in methods.
Beautiful. Modularized front end with a lot of built-in methods. Yeah. Other thoughts? What is Angular?
It's dope.
Dope. Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you.